Greetings, traveler. My name is Sir Belgard, and I am the last knight. Tonight I will tell the story of a young singer who finds herself caught in a battle between prophecy, empire, and a dormant force. If, of course, your heart is brave and your mind sharp. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting stories. And let's begin. The fire in the monastery's great hall burned and crackled against the cold breath of winter. Shadows wavered on the walls, dancing over ancient scrolls pinned with golden clasps, each one painted with the same image, a colossal white dragon, its wings spread wide as if carved from crystal and frost, its gaze sharp enough to pierce through time itself. Snow hissed against the high windows as the wind howled like some unseen beast circling the walls. Inside, a dozen children sat cross-legged upon woven mats, their cheeks flushed from the heat of the flames, their wide eyes fixed on the elder who sat before them. Mehran, the last chronicler of the Order of the Silver Dawn, leaned forward on his staff, his face lined with more years than any mortal should have endured, yet his voice was still deep and steady, as if carved from stone. The light from the hearth caught the glint of his eyes that had seen too much. Every beat of his heart, Mehran whispered, so softly that the children unconsciously leaned closer, gives birth to magic. Every breath shapes the winds. Every dream can bend the world itself. His fingers, gnarled and trembling, brushed over the edge of one scroll. But when that heart stops, when it falls silent, the world will be left to wither in darkness, and nothing will rise again. A boy near the front shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of those words. One girl dared to ask, her voice fragile, "Master Mehran, is he truly asleep? Or is he gone?" The old monk's gaze drifted to the far window, where the snow pressed against the glass as though it longed to come inside. "He sleeps," Mehran said at last, "buried deep in the mountain of the tears of heaven. His name has been spoken only in secret for 1,000 years, and even then, only by fools or the desperate." The fire crackled, and for a moment it seemed the carved dragon on the scrolls shimmered, as though the paint itself remembered flight. Outside the monastery, the storm thickened. The wind roared across the mountain passes, carrying with it a sound no villager could describe, a slow, heavy thud, muffled by leagues of stone and ice. It was not the sound of shifting earth, nor the groan of a glacier. It was too steady, too alive. Somewhere, far beyond mortal reach, a massive heart beat once, then again, like a drum fading into silence. No ear in the hall heard it. None but the wind. Mehran closed his eyes as if listening to something far away, and when he spoke again, it was almost to himself. "The day will come when that heart quickens, and on that day, the choice will not be his alone." The storm outside struck the walls in a fresh wave, rattling the shutters. A scroll slipped from its place on the wall and fell open before the fire. The children gasped at the image inside, a battlefield frozen in mid-destruction. Warriors turned to statues of ice, a city shattered beneath a single sweep of a crystalline wing. The dragon's eyes glowed silver in the painting, and even in ink, they burned with judgment. Mehran lifted the scroll with care, rolling it tightly as if afraid the image might escape. "The Silver Dawn swore to guard his resting place," he said, his voice growing low and grave. "But the centuries have thinned our ranks. Greed has fattened the empire, and there are those who would break the seal for power." One child whispered, "Would they not be destroyed?" Mehran's eyes sharpened. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they would be given exactly what they seek. That is the danger of waking a legend. One never knows if the dream it brings will be salvation, or ruin." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The children huddled closer together, each one secretly wondering what kind of dream a sleeping god might have, and whether they would live to see it. Far away, beyond mountains and seas, snow buried the world in white silence. Beneath that silence lay stone, beneath stone lay ice, and beneath ice, a heart kept its slow, ancient rhythm. Waiting. Fog moved like a living creature along the shattered avenues of the Isle of Guardians, drawing soft veils over the broken faces of statues and the fallen roofs of temples where seabirds nested in cradles of carved stone, and as dawn tried and failed to climb the grey sky, Mirabelle stepped barefoot among wet grasses and pale lichen with a woven satchel at her hip and a knife of bone in her palm, gathering the bitter herbs that soothed fever and the sweet ones that chased nightmares toward the cliffs, and while she worked she kept turning her head toward the largest ruin where dragon sigils were chiseled in spirals along a toppled column, because in the breathe between waves she thought she heard a slow rhythm under the earth, a hush like a distant drum, and the thought came unbidden and frightening that the island itself had a heartbeat, and it was counting down to something that no one in the harbor would be ready to meet. By noon the fog thinned to a milky silver, and the gulls traced ragged circles where a roof once held council fires, and Mirabelle lingered in that lacework of light, running her fingers over a bas-relief of a wing that had survived storms and wars and the clumsy chisels of treasure hunters, and she told herself that the chill racing from stone into skin meant nothing, that it was only the wind from the northern current sliding inland with its knives of cold, yet her mouth shaped a melody. Without her consent, a low humming that bent around the columns and slipped into the empty doorways, and the sound returned to her with a faint echo that lengthened the notes until they felt older than any song she had learned, which was why she pressed her palm to her throat and whispered, almost scolding, that she would not do this again, that she would not invite attention, that she had survived precisely because her voice was a small fire carried in cupped hands and never allowed to grow into a beacon. When the lamps kindled in the harbor and the ropes creaked on the masts and the tide slurped along the cobbles, Mirabelle pushed open the tavern door and stepped into the warmth, and the sailors who worked the ice routes and the pearl nets looked up in the same tired way they always did, as if expecting the night to be an old story with the same ending. And old Soren behind the bar lifted his jug toward her with that rough affection that masked an anxiety he never named, and he said in a voice that was meant to be casual yet trembled because nothing had been casual since the northern lights turned white last winter, that the men had been on the water too long and the gulls had flown inland at dusk, which was never a good sign. And would she be so kind as to sing something with warmth in it because the fog had climbed into everyone's bones? And Mirabelle smiled in the way that calmed people and did not promise anything they did not deserve. And she answered that warmth lived where breath met hope, and she would try to guide both into the rafters. She stood on the low plank they called a stage, and the first tune she chose was the one about harbor lights finding their own reflections when ships returned unbroken, and the men laughed and muttered because superstition demanded they scold any singer who tempted fate, and she laughed with them in a way that did not break the spell, and then she let the second song coil out, slower and clearer. A story of a guardian who slept beneath the mountain and dreamed silver weather into being, and eyes lifted from cups because the vowels were bright and the consonants were soft like falling snow, and coins chimed into the bowl at her feet, copper and brass and the occasional nick token, and she should have stopped there because the room was warm and safe and ordinary, yet the third song rose of its own will, a melody that had no words at first and then had words she did not recognize. And she knew by the way Soren set down the jug and the pearl divers leaned forward without blinking, that the song was not hers alone. A lantern above the hearth flickered wide and held like a pupil widening, and frost traced the rim of a window although the logs burned high and fat, and the dragon emblem carved into the tavern beam to keep thieves honest gave a whisper of pale light as if moonstone had been worked into the wood, then went dark as though embarrassed by its own glow. The room went so quiet that a cork settling in a bottle could be heard at the back table. And a sailor with scars like rope beneath his ear said, in a tone that wanted to be playful but broke into awe halfway through, that his grandmother had taught him a winter hymn with that same turn in the middle where the note holds like a hell breath. And did Mirabelle mean to call snow into a room in the height of a fishing season, because nets froze when songs went wrong and they would rather not test the blessing of their luck this week? Mirabelle answered with a steady voice that carried apology and defiance in equal measure that songs sometimes chose the singer and sometimes arrived with their own weather, and that no harm would come while she stood here because she had no wish to bring storms indoors. And Soren, who had seen her arrive on this island with a lark's courage and a grief he respected by never naming, leaned his elbows on the bar and said in a gentle, weary sprawl of a sentence that he believed her, as he always had and would continue to do so even when the gulls learned to speak, Yet he hoped she would keep certain melodies tucked away until the spring markets opened and the Empire's tax boats were distracted by numbers, for there were ears in the harbor that reported to men who collected more than coins, and it would be kinder to everyone if the room remained simply a room and not a shrine. She nodded and let the next tune be a fisherman's dance, the kind that warmed feet and turned smiles easy, and the noise returned in layers: laughter, the clack of dice, the soft thunder of tankards, the cheerful lies about weather that kept courage bright, and for a few breaths Mirabelle believed she had mended whatever thinness her third song had torn in the air. Until the door opened in a squall of fog and a cloaked traveler stood braced against the wind with a parcel wrapped in oilskin, and, though he spoke only to ask for a room with a dry floor and a corner near the chimney, his gaze slid to her bowl of coins with a measuring comb and then to the lantern that had flared, and he smiled without warmth, as if a puzzle had offered him its first honest clue. After the last chorus faded and the clapping fell into friendly talk, Mirabelle slipped through the kitchen and into the courtyard where rain barrels waited beneath eaves and the night smelled of wet rope and nettle tea, and she pressed both hands to her chest not in panic but in fierce resolve, because fear had a way of making choices for those who allowed it, and she would not allow it. And she told the darkness in a voice that did not tremble that her songs were meant to mend what had been broken in the silence after storms, and if something ancient listened from the far side of the mountain, then it could keep its distance until she invited it closer, which she did not plan to do, not now, not until she knew why the island had started breathing beneath her feet. Yet when she opened her palm to take the small sprig of frost leaf she wore for luck, a sheen of silver light trickled along the veins of the leaf and pooled at the base like dew that had learned to glow, and the sound she had heard among the ruins returned as a faint tapping beneath her skin, not dangerous, not loud, but unmistakable. And she realized with a rush of cold wonder that her ordinary world had shifted by a finger's width, and would never shift back, and inside the tavern the cloaked traveler counted her coins by listening to the sound they made rather than by looking, and far above the harbor a cloud moved away from the moon, and the Isle of Guardians showed its scars like maps and waited for someone to read them aloud. The storm came suddenly, as if the heavens had been holding their breath until this very moment, and now exhaled with a howl that rattled the bones of the Isle of Guardians. Rain slashed sideways through the ruined columns, each drop like a shard of glass driven by the wind. Mirabelle's cape, worn thin by years of salt air, clung heavy to her shoulders, and her hair, darkened by the downpour, streamed across her face. She stumbled over a half-buried stone step, seeking shelter from the lightning that tore the sky into trembling fragments. The temple before her, once a place of solemn prayers to forgotten gods, stood abandoned for centuries. Broken arches groaned under the weight of creeping ivy, and its shadowed interior seemed to breathe with a coldness that was not entirely from the storm. She pushed inside, her boots splashing into shallow pools left by the leaking roof. Her breath echoed back to her in the hollow silence, mixing with the distant thunder. The air carried the scent of stone, wet moss, and something faintly metallic, an old memory of fire and steel. Her fingers brushed the carved walls, tracing spirals and scales etched in silver-gray relief. She had seen these markings before in the sailors' tales and in the faded books of the monastery, symbols of a guardian who had not walked the earth for centuries. She thought of them as nothing more than old stories, until lightning struck so close that the ground shook. The tremor loosened a piece of the wall. Stone clattered to the floor, revealing a fragment of something smooth, something that did not belong to rock. It glowed faintly, as though it remembered the light from another age. Mirabelle knelt, the pounding of rain outside muffled by the strange hush that settled over her. She reached out and brushed the dust away, and there it was, a scale, as large as her hand, its surface the shifting silver white of moonlight on ice. It was warm. No, alive. The light within it pulsed, slow at first, then faster, until it matched the rhythm of her own heartbeat. And then, without sound, came a voice. It was not heard with ears, but with the marrow of her bones. Deep, resonant, ancient beyond measure, it rolled through her like a distant avalanche. "Wake me up!" She gasped, pulling her hand back, but the light flared as if in answer to her fear. Her heart raced and the voice came again, stronger, colder, yet with an edge of longing. You carry my echo. You are the one. A shiver crawled down her spine. The rain outside had stopped without her noticing, the storm dying as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the temple in an unnatural stillness. Her own breath sounded too loud, and her fingers trembled as she stared at the scale, watching it pulse like the heartbeat of some great sleeping beast. Mirabelle's mind filled with fragments she could not understand, visions of wings unfolding over a sunlit horizon, of fire cascading down mountains, of a shadow falling over cities she did not know. The voice whispered again, so close it might have been inside her own thoughts. Time grows thin. The world waits for my breath. She wanted to run. To throw the scales back into the darkness of the temple where she picked them up and pretend none of this happened. Yet her feet did not move. Instead, she pressed the scale closer, feeling the warmth seep into her skin until it became almost unbearable. Somewhere beyond the walls, a sound like a bell tolling once carried across the wind, long, deep, and sorrowful. She did not know if it was real or if it came from the same place as the voice, but the moment she heard it, she understood with a certainty that turned her stomach. She had been chosen for something she could not refuse. The last flicker of lightning illuminated her reflection in the polished surface of the scale. Her silver eyes shone back at her, and for a fleeting instant they were not her own. They belonged to something vast, something that had seen centuries pass like the turning of pages. And when the light faded, she was left standing in the cold silence, her pulse still racing, the scales still beating in time with her heart. That night, Mirabelle could not stay in the tavern, could not bear the noise and the easy laughter, not with the weight of the scale hidden beneath her bedroll. She told herself she would return it to the temple at first light, that she would place it back in the dust and walk away without looking over her shoulder. She told herself this over and over, like a prayer against the unease curling in her stomach. Yet when she finally lay down in the narrow loft above the common room, the sound of the rain on the roof gave way to something else, an oppressive quiet that made her feel as though the night was holding its breath. Sleep did not come gently. One moment she was staring at the beams above her, the next she was standing in a place she had never seen, though it felt older than memory. The sky was black, not the blue black of night, but the void black of an extinguished flame. Ash drifted in the air like snow, settling on towers that leaned like broken teeth. She turned in place, and everywhere she looked, cities burned without fire, as if their lifeblood had been drained in an instant. People ran in silence, their faces distorted in terror. And then she saw one, a man no older than herself, stumble and crumple. She reached for him, but as her fingers touched his shoulder, he withered before her eyes. All around her, the same horror unfolded, children aging to frailty in the space of a heartbeat, warriors dropping their swords as their strength was stolen, lovers turning to strangers in the blink of an eye. She wanted to scream, but the air itself seemed stolen from her lungs. And through it all, the sound of a great heart beating, faster and faster, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. The ground split beneath her feet. From the darkness below rose two eyes, silver and merciless, vast as storm moons. A voice, no longer the cold whisper she had heard in the temple, but something deeper, heavier, and infinite, filled the burning sky. This is what comes when the heart is silenced. This is the stillness after the last breath. Mirabelle fell to her knees, hands clamped over her ears, but the voice spoke inside her bones. The sky cracked open above her, revealing not light, but a churning emptiness that seemed to drink everything into itself, the streets, the towers, the people, and she was pulled upward with them, weightless, helpless, as the silver eyes watched without blinking. She woke with a sharp cry, her throat raw, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tears streaked her cheeks, though she could not remember when they had begun to fall. The loft was cold, but her palms burned as though she had been holding fire. She pushed the bedroll aside, reaching for the scale, but it no longer pulsed with warmth. Its surface was dull, its light hidden, yet she could still feel the echo of its rhythm deep in her chest. She sat there for a long time, trembling, staring at the scale in the half-light from the shuttered window. The vision had been too vivid, too precise to be a dream. Somewhere in the marrow of her bones, she knew it for what it was, a prophecy. And if the silver eyes belonged to the same voice that had called to her in the temple, then perhaps she had not been chosen to save the world at all. Perhaps she was meant to witness its undoing. By the time dawn bled pale across the harbor, Mirabelle had made her decision. She would take the scale back to the temple. She would bury it in the rubble and let the storm-worn gods guard it. She would live her life as she always had, singing for coin, gathering herbs, avoiding the eyes of those who might see her as more than she wished to be. Whatever ancient things slept beneath the mountains, it would not wake because of her. Yet even as she rose, tucking the scale into a cloth and knotting it shut, she could not shake the feeling that the choice had already been made, and not by her. The market on the Isle of Guardians was a storm of voices and colors, a place where the scent of spiced fish tangled with the briny breath of the sea, where merchants argued over the price of dyed silk and children darted between barrels with stolen apples hidden under their cloaks. Mirabelle moved through it with her hood drawn low, the wrapped scale hidden deep in her satchel. She kept telling herself this was the last day it would be in her possession, that by sunset she would be rid of it forever. But the market's noise could not smother the sound she kept hearing under it all, faint and steady, like a heartbeat deep beneath the cobblestones. She paused near a stall selling carved bone charms, running her fingers over one shaped like a crescent moon, when a voice spoke from behind her, measured, deep, and too close to ignore. "You carry something that does not belong to you." Mirabelle turned sharply. An old man stood there, wrapped in a robe of weathered gray, his bald head bowed slightly as if he were studying her without needing to lift his eyes. His face was lined, but not with the idle wear of age. These were the marks of a man who had walked through storms and returned. At his belt hung a string of prayer beads that glinted with a silver sheen, and in his hand he leaned on a staff carved with symbols she almost recognized from the ruined temple. "I don't know what you mean," she said, adjusting her satchel instinctively. The man's gaze flicked to it with the precision of an arrow. "The scale. Silver-white, warm to the touch, marked with the breath of a heart that has not beaten freely in 1,000 years. You found it during the storm." Her pulse stuttered. "You followed me?" "I listened," he replied simply, as if that were enough. Things such as this announce themselves to those who are trained to hear. Something in his voice made her forget her anger. "Who are you?" "Mayran," he said. "Once of the Order of the Silver Dawn. We kept the old stories when the world forgot them, and we stood watch over the seals that bind what should not yet wake." He stepped closer, his eyes like pieces of weathered sky. "You have in your hands the first sign of Alvirion stirring." The name fell heavy between them. She had heard it only in songs meant for firelit nights, tales told to make children stare into the dark with wide eyes. A dragon of crystal and frost, whose breath could heal or burn, whose flight could bring dawn or plunge the world into a season without end. "That's just a legend," she said, though the words felt weak even as she spoke them. Mayran shook his head. "Legends are seeds. Some never grow. Some lie dormant until the right storm, the right hands, the right hour." His voice lowered. "In 4 nights, the silver flame moon will rise. It comes once in a century. If the awakening ritual is not performed before the moon sets, the scale will fade, the bond will break, and Alvirion will return to his sleep, perhaps for another 100 years, perhaps forever. And if the wrong hands hold his heart when he wakes." He left the sentence unfinished, but Mirabelle saw the flicker of something in his eyes, not fear exactly, but the memory of it. "Why tell me this?" she asked. "If you've guarded this secret for so long, why put it into the hands of a stranger?" "Because the Empire already knows," Mayran said, glancing toward the distant watchtower where banners snapped in the wind. "Lord Varric rides with his soldiers even now. They will not ask, they will not bargain, they will take. And if they claim the dragon's heart, they will use it to bend the world to their will. You, Mirabelle, are the one the scale chose. I can guide you, but only you can wake him." She almost laughed. "You think I'm going to walk into the mountains carrying the most dangerous relic in the known world? I saw what happens if he wakes. Cities burning. Her voice cracked before she could stop it. If that was a vision of the future, why would I risk bringing it about? Mehran's expression softened, but his reply was steady. Because sometimes the only way to stop a fire is to bring it into the open, where it can burn itself out before it consumes the roots. Leave Alvirion to be found by Varek, and your vision will not be of what may come, it will be of what will come. The market noise seemed to dull around her. Mirabelle's fingers tightened around the satchel strap. She wanted to turn away, to vanish into the crowd and forget the name Alvirion entirely. But there was a truth in Mehran's words that she could not shake, and in his presence she felt the pull of a choice she was not ready to make. Somewhere beyond the market stalls, a horn sounded from the harbor, low, urgent, and out of place on a trading day. Mehran's gaze shifted toward the mountains, and in that moment Mirabelle knew that whatever path she chose, the Empire's shadow was already moving toward her. The morning she left the Isle of Guardians, the sea was restless, rolling in heavy swells that slapped against the docks with a sound like slow applause. The harbor smelled of rope, wet timber, and the promise of rain, though the sky above was only a dull iron gray. Mirabelle stood with her satchel slung across her shoulder, the scale wrapped in layers of cloth and bound with cord, as if tighter knots could keep its presence from bleeding into the air. Beside her, Mehran's face was unreadable beneath his hood. His staff clicked softly against the planks as they walked toward the waiting figure by the pier. Chiron leaned against the railing of a narrow longboat, his scar catching the light in a thin silver slash from brow to cheek. His armor was piecemeal, leather reinforced with battered steel plates, and the sword at his hip had seen more than its share of repairs. He looked like a man who had walked through battles and come out alive not because of luck, but because something in him refused to let go. Yet his eyes, a pale gray that caught no warmth, weighed Mirabelle the way a hunter might assess unfamiliar prey. "This is him?" Mirabelle asked under her breath. "Chiron knows the frozen valleys better than anyone who still breathes," Mehran replied. "You'll need his skill to reach the mountain of the tears of heaven before Varek's men." Chiron's gaze flicked to her satchel. "That's it." She stiffened. "If you know that much, then you know it's not something I'm carrying lightly." "Light or heavy," he said, stepping into the boat. "Once the Empire gets close, you won't be carrying it at all." He gestured for her to follow. "Best get moving before the tide turns against us." The oars cut through the water with slow, steady rhythm, the island shrinking behind them until the ruins of the Isle of Guardians were little more than gray smudges in the mist. The air grew colder as they approached the mainland, the scent of snow riding the wind. By the time they reached the river that would carry them north, a fine powder was already gathering along the banks, muffling the sound of their landing. The journey into the frozen valleys began beneath skies the color of old steel. Pines crowded the narrow paths, their branches sagging under fresh snow, and the silence here was heavier than any Mirabelle had known. No gulls, no waves, only the crunch of boots and the hiss of breath. She could feel the scales' warmth through the layers of cloth, steady against her hip, as if it knew they were drawing closer to the place it belonged. On their first night in the mountains, they made camp in the shelter of a half-collapsed watchtower. Mehran tended the small fire with hands that moved in precise, deliberate motions, while Chiron sat apart, sharpening his sword with slow, even strokes. The sound was hypnotic, metal whispering over stone, again and again. Mirabelle tried to rest, but the wind outside shifted, carrying with it a low, resonant sound. It was not the howl of air through the stones, nor the groan of ice shifting in the valley. It was longer, deeper, like the toll of a distant bell, each note heavy enough to settle in her chest. She sat up, meeting Mehran's eyes. He had heard it too, she could see it in the stillness of his hands. Chiron didn't look up from his work. "That's not wind," he said. "What is it?" Mirabelle asked. "Something old," Mehran murmured. "And very far away. But not far enough." The sound came again, fainter this time, yet carrying the same weight, as if each note were marking the passing of something precious. Mirabelle clutched the satchel tighter, unable to decide if the sound was calling her forward or warning her away. The fire cracked sharply, sending a spray of sparks into the cold air, and in their brief light she thought she saw movement beyond the snow, a shadow slipping between the trees, too quick to follow. Chiron rose, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "We're not alone out here." And though the night around them seemed to hold its breath, Mirabelle knew that whatever had stirred in the dark was not the last shadow they would face before reaching the mountain. The frozen valleys stretched before them like a graveyard of forgotten ages, each peak a monument carved in silence, each ravine a wound where the earth had bled snow and ice for centuries. Days blurred into nights as the three travelers pressed onward, the air thinning with every step, their breaths smoking like offerings to a sky that never softened. Mirabelle's fingers grew numb despite the wool wrappings, yet each time she thought she might falter, the satchel at her side pulsed faintly with warmth, as though reminding her that she was carrying more than her own weight. It was on the 7th day that they found the city. At first it seemed to be only another scattering of white shapes half buried in snowdrifts, but as they descended the slope, broken spires and shattered arches emerged from the ice, their surfaces veined with frost like cracked porcelain. The gates still stood, carved from obsidian that gleamed faintly under the pale light, but they opened onto streets where time itself seemed to have stopped. The silence was too complete. No birds, no wind, not even the groan of settling ice. And then Mirabelle saw them, children, barefoot and pale, standing in the shadow of a frozen fountain. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their faces untouched by years, though their clothing was worn and tattered. One boy raised a hand in hesitant greeting, but his skin glimmered faintly, as if light itself was caught beneath it. "They haven't grown," she whispered. Mayron's face was grave. "The clocks here stopped long ago. And with them, so did time." Chiron moved past them, his scar catching the cold light. "Then let's not linger." But the children followed. Not close, not hostile, only watching. Their silence was worse than any threat. As they moved deeper into the city, Mirabelle caught glimpses of others, a woman frozen mid-step, her hair drifting as though underwater, an old man bent over a game board, his hand hovering eternally above a piece. None of them aged. None of them breathed. Yet their eyes followed. When the sun dipped, staining the ice with red-gold fire, they camped at the edge of a long avenue. Mirabelle tried to sleep, but the children lingered at the edges of the firelight, their faces glowing faintly. She closed her eyes and sang softly, a melody meant to soothe her own fear. The scale in her satchel grew warm, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of recognition in the children's eyes, as if the song had touched something buried deep within them. Then came the howl. It ripped through the frozen city like the tearing of metal, low and savage, yet layered with something that almost sounded human. Chiron was on his feet in an instant, sword drawn, the firelight flashing along the sword. Shadows surged between the broken walls, creatures with bodies like wolves, their fur black as soot, but their eyes burned red, hot as molten iron. They came in silence, their paws making no sound against the ice. The first leapt at Chiron, who met it with a slash that sent sparks hissing as steel struck, as though bone had been fused with ore. Another lunged at Mirabelle. She stumbled back, the satchel sliding from her shoulder. Panic clawed her throat, but the hymn rose from her lips before she could think, sharp and clear, each note carrying through the night. The scale answered, searing hot in her hands as she clutched it. Light streamed in from its surface, silver-white, and the wolf creatures recoiled with snarls, their eyes dimming for an instant before they regrouped. "Sing, girl!" Chiron shouted. The hymn filled the air, her voice trembling but strong, and each note seemed to weave with the light of the scale, forming a barrier the creatures dared not cross. They circled at the edges, their molten eyes flickering, until at last, with one final, echoing howl, they slipped back into the ruins and vanished. The silence returned, broken only by Mirabelle's shuddering breath. She sank to her knees, the scale cooling slowly in her palms. Around them, the children had retreated into the shadows, their faces unreadable, their stillness deeper than ever. Chiron wiped his sword clean on the snow, his gaze lingering on her. "Your song isn't just a song." "I know," she whispered, though the truth was heavier than the words. Mayron lowered himself beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Every step forward will draw us closer to both allies and enemies. And you must learn to tell one from the other, before it is too late. The fire crackled weakly, their only warmth against the night, while somewhere deep in the ruined city, a bell began to toll again, slow and mournful, counting down toward a fate they could no longer avoid. The dreams came more fiercely now, no longer gentle fragments of symbols and half-seen images but storms of fire and shadow that claimed her every time her eyes closed. By day Mirabelle trudged through snowfields and jagged ridges, her breath ragged in the thin air, but by night she was dragged into visions that left her trembling and unable to meet the other's eyes come morning. The first of these came beneath a sky so black it seemed the stars themselves had fled in fear. She stood upon a ridge of glass where the world below burned in rivers of molten fire. Vast wings blotted out what little light remained, wings that shimmered with crystal brilliance yet carried a darkness deeper than night. Dragons, hundreds, perhaps thousands, circled overhead, their scales black as volcanic rock, their eyes dripping sparks of fire as they descended upon helpless cities. With every sweep of their wings, towers crumbled, walls shattered, and the earth split apart, spewing ash and ruin. Then, through the thunder of destruction, a voice rose, low, immense, commanding. It was the same voice that had once whispered to her in sorrow, the voice that had begged her to wake it. But now it was different. No longer pleading, no longer weary, it was a voice that carried law, judgment, and hunger. I am Alvirion. I am balance restored through fire. The words rattled her bones. She looked up, and there he was, vaster than any dream could contain, his body carved of white crystal but veined with black fire between the cracks. His gaze fell upon her, and she felt the air freeze and burn all at once. You will stand beside me, he declared, his voice spreading across the skies like thunder. You will be my voice in this age. Through you, my flame shall cleanse. I never asked for this. Mirabelle cried, though her words felt like a fragile whisper against the weight of his. I wanted to live in peace. I wanted only to sing. The dragon tilted his head, and his voice shifted, lower, almost soft, though no less terrible. Peace is the silence after fire. Your songs will be hymns of judgment. You cannot flee what has already begun. She woke screaming. Chiron was at her side, his sword half drawn, eyes darting into the shadows beyond the campfire. Mayran gripped her shoulders, steadying her as she shook, her face damp with sweat despite the freezing cold. It was him, she whispered hoarsely, clutching at the satchel where the scale pulsed faintly against the cloth. Alvirion. His voice, it was not what it was before. He spoke of fire, of cleansing. He wants me to follow him. Mayran's eyes darkened with something more than concern. Dreams are the bridge between what is hidden and what is to come. If you hear his voice, then his will is stirring even before his body wakes. Chiron narrowed his eyes, his voice edged with suspicion. Or she's already being bent to him. How do we know she won't walk us straight into his jaws when the time comes? Mirabelle's chest tightened. I would never. You don't know what you would do. Chiron cut in sharply. None of us do. If that thing is already inside your head, then it's only a matter of time before you're his. Enough, Mayran said, his voice firm, though it trembled with urgency. He looked at Mirabelle, his hand resting on hers with surprising gentleness. Fear is what he will use to bind you. Fear of him, fear of yourself. But listen, Mirabelle, there is always choice. That is the one power dragons cannot claim from mortals. They can sway, they can burn, but they cannot choose for you. Her breath shook as she looked between them, Chiron's mistrust like a weapon pressed against her back, Mayran's words like a fragile shield. She clutched the satchel closer, feeling the heat of the scales seep into her chest until it almost hurt. But later, when the others had fallen into uneasy sleep and the fire burned low, Mirabelle sat awake beneath the wheeling stars. The memory of Alvirion's voice still coiled in her veins. And though she told herself again and again that she would never be his, a sliver of doubt gnawed at her, because when he had spoken, some hidden part of her had not felt fear. It had felt all. And all was dangerous. The mountain of the tears of heaven rose before them like the back of a god turned in sorrow, its slopes clad in perpetual ice, its summit lost in clouds so white they seemed carved from bone. For days they had marched toward it, their feet sinking into snow that never melted, their breaths shallow in the thinning air. Mirabelle's satchel had grown heavier with each step, as though the scale itself were pulling toward the heart buried within the mountain. The wind keen like a dirge through the passes, and each gust carried with it the taste of iron and something older, something bitter with memory. At the mountain's base, where cliffs reared up like frozen walls, they found no solitude. Columns of armored soldiers crept along the foothills, their banners bearing the sigil of the Empire, black suns on crimson cloth. The air vibrated with the faint clangor of weapons, with the barked orders of men too disciplined to fear the cold. Lord Varric's shadow had reached them. They hid among jagged outcroppings, their bodies pressed into stone that stung with cold. Chiron peered from behind the rocks, his eyes narrowing at the sight of cages drawn on sledges, each filled with mages bound in chains of glimmering silver. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. "They're taking them up the mountain," Mirabelle whispered, her throat tight. "For the ritual," Marin said grimly. "They mean to force their will upon Alvirion when he wakes, to bind him before his breath is even his own." Chiron's jaw clenched. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, but his gaze flicked toward Mirabelle's satchel, lingering too long. She caught it, and the air between them sharpened. "Don't even think it!" He didn't answer. Not then. They moved at night, climbing along hidden trails that twisted like scars across the mountain. Snow lashed at their faces, turning the world into a blur of white and shadow. Mirabelle's legs ached with every step, yet the scale's warmth kept her moving, an anchor and a burden all at once. It was near dawn, while the sky was still bruised with gray, that the betrayal came. They had paused to rest in the lee of a cliff. Marin leaned heavily on his staff, his breath ragged, frost crusting his beard. Mirabelle bent to steady him, her hands trembling from exhaustion. That was when she felt the sudden jerk, the satchel torn from her shoulder. She spun. Chiron stood over her, the strap clutched in his fist, the scales' glow seeping faintly through the cloth. His scarred face was unreadable, his eyes cold. "I'll take it to Varric," he said, his voice like stone cracking. "Better the Empire holds it than the world burns in dragon fire." Mirabelle's heart clenched. "You've seen what they'll do, chains, cages. You'd hand him over to them? They'll at least control him," Chiron snapped. You'd let him rise free." "I've seen what free monsters do. I've hunted them. This isn't a legend, girl, it's a weapon. And weapons belong to those strong enough to wield them." Marin forced himself upright, his voice low but fierce. "If you do this, Chiron, you condemn us all. The Empire's hand is not strength, it is rot. They will not wield the dragon, they will drain him until nothing remains but ash." For a moment Chiron's face flickered with doubt. His knuckles whitened on the satchel strap. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the distant sound of horns echoing up the slopes, Imperial scouts drawing closer. And then, from below, came a cry. Soldiers dragging the mages had spotted a movement, had loosed arrows into the snow. He froze. The satchel slipped from his grasp. In that heartbeat of hesitation, he turned, not against Mirabelle, but against the soldiers pouring into the pass. His sword flashed, his roar lost in the wind. Mirabelle seized the satchel, clutching it to her chest. Marin's chant rose behind her, words of power woven into the storm. Snow spiraled in red and white as steel clashed against steel, the mountain itself seeming to shudder with the fury of battle. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough. "Chains are worse than fire." The wind tore the words away, but Mirabelle had heard them. She clutched the satchel tighter, her breath harsh, the weight of the scale heavier than ever. Above them, the mountain loomed, its peak hidden in storm. Somewhere within its heart, Alvirion stirred, and the world trembled with him. The cave mouth yawned like the throat of an ancient beast, its teeth made of icicles, its breath a chill that sank straight into the marrow. Inside, the walls glowed with a faint, ghostly blue, the frozen veins of the mountain shimmering with trapped light as if stars had been caught beneath the ice and left there to flicker in eternal silence. Mirabelle stepped inside, the satchel clutched to her chest, her pulse racing to match the steady, unnatural throb of the scale within. Behind her came Chiron, sword drawn, eyes searching every shadow. Beside her, Marin leaned heavily on his staff, his face pale but resolute, every step an act of will. The deeper they walked, the louder the sound became, not the drip of melting water or the whisper of wind, but something slower, heavier, like the toll of an unseen bell. Each beat reverberated through the cavern until it felt as though their hearts were no longer their own but puppets pulled by a rhythm older than time. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and shards of frost fell from the ceiling, shattering like glass against the stone. At the heart of the cavern, the chamber widened into a vast cathedral of ice. Pillars rose like frozen columns, their surfaces etched with runes that pulsed faintly in response to the scale's glow. At the center lay a basin carved directly into the mountain floor, filled not with water but with light, silver white, shifting like liquid flame. The air itself seemed to bend above it, as though time struggled to flow in the presence of what lay within. Marin sank to his knees before the basin. His hands trembled as he unrolled a scroll inked with symbols so old they looked more like scars than letters. His voice, though weakened, carried as he began the chant. Low, resonant syllables that seemed to unlock echoes in the cavern itself, every word answered by a murmur of power. Mirabelle set the scale into the basin. The moment it touched the silver flame, the light surged upward, wrapping her in its glow. Her voice caught in her throat, but the chant pulled at her, urged her to join. The melody rose inside her unbidden, a song she had never learned yet somehow always known, a song that wove with Marin's words until the cavern itself trembled with harmony. The ice walls blazed with light. The ground shook as cracks spiderwebbed across the floor. A sound like glass breaking thundered above them, and Mirabelle realized with awe and terror that it was not stone, it was the mountain itself beginning to split. And then came the scream. A sharp whistle of air, the snap of a bowstring, and Marin staggered, his chant breaking off. Mirabelle caught him, her own cry swallowed by the cavern's roar. Imperial soldiers poured into the chamber, their armor gleaming red in the glow. At their head strode Lord Varec, tall, cold, his eyes fixed not on them but on the basin. "Hold the girl," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "The dragon wakes for us, and us alone." Chiron roared in defiance, throwing himself into their path. Marin clutched Mirabelle's hand, his breath ragged. The chant must not stop. His voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes burned with the last embers of his strength. Mirabelle's heart broke, but she raised her head, the song already burning in her throat. She took up the chant where he had left it, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as the basin blazed brighter, the scale dissolving into pure light. Her words echoed, twisting into power, filling the cavern with a storm of sound. The mountain screamed. Cracks ripped through the walls, ice collapsing in sheets. A fissure split the ceiling, and from it burst a torrent of light so blinding it seared her vision. The soldiers staggered, shields raised, their faces twisted in fear. And then, from the basin, he rose. Alvirion, the dragon of crystal. His body shimmered with translucent brilliance, every scale a shard of glass catching the cavern's glow, his wings vast arcs of frozen light that sang with each movement like 1,000 chimes. His eyes opened, silver, endless, and the chamber seemed to bow to his presence. The soldiers broke. Some fled, others fell to their knees, but Lord Varec alone stood unyielding, his face pale yet hungry. "At last," he whispered, raising his hand as though to command the beast. Alvirion's gaze swept the cavern, then fell upon Mirabelle. The song faded on her lips. For a heartbeat, the world was still. And then his voice filled her, not soft, not pleading, but resonant and terrible. "You awaken me. Now I will restore balance." The cavern shook, and from his throat rose a glow brighter than fire. Mirabelle's breath caught as she saw, not with her eyes but within her mind, a vision of the Empire burning under his flame, cities crumbling, banners dissolving in a storm of crystal fire. The world trembled on the edge of ruin. And she, the one who had given him voice, was the only thread holding back the storm. The cavern shuddered beneath the weight of Alvirion's wings. Shards of ice rained down like broken stars, crashing into the basin of silver flame, sending sparks of light scattering across the stone. Mirabelle stood frozen, her voice silenced, her chest heaving as the dragon's presence swallowed the chamber like a tide that could not be resisted. Chiron's sword trembled in his grip, though he did not lower it, his scarred face locked between awe and terror. The soldiers who had dared to remain pressed themselves flat to the ground, their weapons forgotten, their wills shattered. And through it all, Alvirion's gaze never left her. "You awaken me!" The words resounded in her bones, carried on vibrations too deep for mortal ears, yet she heard them as clearly as her own thoughts. "You brought breath to my silence, and for that I give you this truth: balance must be restored, and only fire can bring it." The visions returned, cities engulfed in white flame, towers collapsing into molten ruin, banners burning to ash. But this time she saw more, the faces of those who had once chained mages, who had marched under the sun of the Empire. She saw them cry out, their fortresses falling, their legions turned to glass. She saw not just destruction, but judgment. Her knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of it. "If you do this," she whispered, her voice breaking, "whole nations will vanish." Alvirion lowered his vast head, his crystal scales chiming as they shifted. His voice was a thunder wrapped in sorrow. Innocence cannot thrive in poisoned soil. The Empire's roots reach everywhere, their shadow suffocates the earth. Burn the roots, and the world may grow anew. Mairin groaned where he lay, his face pale as stone. His hand reached weakly toward her. "Do not believe him without question," he rasped. "Dragons see balance, but balance is not mercy. You must decide if his fire is justice, or only vengeance." Chiron's voice rang out, raw and furious. "And if you side with him, girl? What then? You'll be the dragon's herald while the world drowns in flame? You'll trade chains for fire and call it freedom?" Mirabelle clutched the satchel though the scale within was gone, dissolved into Alvirion's light, yet she held it as though it were still there. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break. All eyes were on her. And in her mind the visions warred with each other. She saw villages broken beneath their taxes, voices silenced under their banners. Could she deny that the world cried out for change? Yet she also saw the other side, faces she had never met, lives not yet lived, all swept away in the fire of one being's judgment. If she stood with Alvirion, the Empire would burn, but so too would all caught in its shadow. If she defied him, she won't get out of here anymore, her voice crushed before it could shape even a word of hope. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why must it be me who chooses?" Alvirion's eyes blazed silver, and his answer rolled like an avalanche through the cavern. "Because you are the bridge. Mortal blood, mortal song. My heart beats in your hands now, and through you, the choice of fire or silence will be made. I am strength without end, yet it is your will that will shape the dawn." The cavern fell silent, the soldiers barely daring to breathe, the world itself seeming to pause. Mirabelle felt the scales echo pulsing within her chest, binding her to the dragon, binding her to fate. Her lips parted, her voice rising, not in song this time, but in the words that would seal everything. Would she call herself his voice, the herald of fire and judgment? Or would she raise her fragile, mortal defiance against a being older than empires? The mountains seemed to lean closer, waiting. And with a breath that shook her to her soul, Mirabelle understood, there was no path without ruin. Only choice. The cavern trembled as if it, too, awaited her answer. The soldiers who had not fled crouched low, trembling before the crystal leviathan whose wings brushed the walls with every slow, deliberate movement. Chiron stood unbowed, his sword gleaming dully in the ghostly light, though the tremor in his arm betrayed the weight of what he faced. Alvirion's gaze pierced her, unrelenting, silver fire flickering deep within those vast crystalline orbs. The world groans under the Empire's yoke. You have seen it in chains and cages. You have seen what balance demands. Speak, and I will cleanse. Speak, and fire will become dawn. Mirabelle's breath shuddered in her throat. She thought of the children she had seen in her vision, aging into dust in the space of a heartbeat. She thought of the bound mages dragged like cattle through the snow, their eyes emptied by despair. She thought of her own songs, sung for copper coins, never meant to be anything more than a fragile flame in the dark. And now, her voice carried the weight of nations. Chiron's shout cracked the silence. If you choose him, girl, you choose to be the end to a world that never asked for it. Don't let his fire make you blind, vengeance isn't balance. Mayran coughed, yet his voice came steady. She must choose, Chiron. No one else can. Not you, not I, not even Alvirion. That is the burden of the bridge. Mirabelle closed her eyes. The cavern's roar faded until she heard only two things, the pounding of her own heart and the echo of the scale, still pulsing within her chest as though it had replaced her mortal rhythm with something vaster. She felt the weight of fire coiled within her, waiting, and with it the knowledge that silence, too, was a choice that might bury the dragon forever. She opened her eyes, silver light reflecting in them, and raised her voice. I will be your voice, she said, every syllable trembling yet unbroken. Not because I long for fire, not because I believe in mercy or vengeance, but because I will not let chains decide the fate of this world. If dawn must come through flame, then let it be my song that carries it, not the Empire's iron. Alvirion bowed his head, and the cavern shone brighter than day as his wings unfurled. His roar shattered the last of the ice ceiling, sending a torrent of light pouring into the sky. Soldiers cried out in terror, fleeing into the snow as their armor melted around them. Lord Varrock raised his sword in defiance, but the crystal flames swept him away in silence, leaving only glass where he had stood. Chiron staggered, horror etched across his face. You've doomed us all, he spat, though his voice cracked, torn between rage and despair. The world will burn, and you've chosen to be its torch. Mirabelle turned to him, her silver-lit eyes heavy with sorrow. No, Chiron. I've chosen to be its song. And songs can heal as well as destroy. But even as she spoke, Alvirion's fire poured across the horizon, sweeping over the valleys and the plains beyond, a tide of crystal flame that consumed the Empire's banners, its fortresses, its armies. Cities fell like leaves in a storm, their spires collapsing in silence, their people swept into a new age they had not chosen. The world had changed. The Empire was ash. And in its place rose the Age of Dragons. High above, Mirabelle stood astride the mountain, her voice rising to meet the thunder of wings, her song carried on the wind like a hymn and a warning. She had bound herself to a legend, and in doing so had become one herself. But as the fire spread, her heart ached with the question that would never leave her: had she delivered salvation, or only traded one darkness for another? The snow carried no answer. Only the sound of beating wings, and the world reborn in flame.